Welcome to What Catholics Believe. I'm your host, Julius Smetona. You know, today we live in a time of ever-increasing preoccupation with our minds, how we feel, how our emotional states are. In fact, it's gotten to the point where many of us are afraid to cancel a golf game or even schedule a golf game without first consulting our psychiatrists. In spite of this, few people, if any, are aware that there is such a thing as a Catholic system of psychology, a Catholic notion of relation between soul and mind. With us to discuss this system is Father Donald Sanborn, Chaplain General of Catholic Men for Christ the King. Father Sanborn, welcome to What Catholics Believe. Father, what is Catholic psychology?
Well, it is really the Catholic Church that came up with the word psychology long before Freud did. It simply means the study of the soul. Psyche in Greek means soul. And so in Catholic philosophy, it was always part of the curriculum to study psychology. But when you say that seminarians are studying psychology, it makes people think that they're learning about all of the systems that people are familiar with today as psychology, when in fact that's not true at all. The Catholic Church teaches that human beings have a spiritual and immortal soul that is distinct from their bodies. And modern psychology teaches, if not explicitly, and usually it does say it explicitly, but at least implicitly will say that human beings are animals, and that their reactions to things are the same as those of animals.
How do we know that human beings have a soul? What kind of indication or justification could you give for such a claim?
Because anything will act according to what it is. I'm sure you've heard the expression, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. And that is common sense. A thing will act according to its nature. It will be what it is, not only in itself, but also in its operation. So we know that there is a spiritual soul in human beings because they have actions which are spiritual. I'll give you an example. Everyone in the whole world knows what justice is. Yet, you cannot point to any material thing that is justice. And people in Africa, people in Asia, people in North America, and in Europe all know what justice is. They all have a word for it. They all want it, even though they all have different individual experiences of what just acts are. And that is simply one example of the fact that the human mind knows spiritual realities. So
this concept of justice is what philosophers, particularly Thomistic philosophers, would call a metaphysical idea, perhaps.
Yes, it's an abstraction. You know the idea of the infinite, the idea of the necessary. Those things would be impossible for an animal to know. No animal has ever spoken to you or to me about what is necessary, what is infinite, has never thirsted for justice or asked for mercy.
So you're saying these concepts or ideas imply the existence of a soul because they are perceived by a soul, or this is a...
Yes, that it would be impossible for matter, which is impervious to things around it, to conceive of such things which are purely immaterial. It is also another proof of the spirituality of the soul is the human consciousness, that it is conscious of its own acts. It would be impossible for matter to reflect upon itself. The very basis of knowing something is an immaterial soul, because matter by nature must be acted upon in order to have some reaction. That is, that it cannot take in something that isn't itself.
How then is this relationship between thought processes and soul? When we think about solving a concrete problem, is this our soul that is doing the thinking, or is this brain cells and chemical reactions which are bringing about this reasoning?
Both. And that is the beauty of the Catholic psychology, is that it rests on the very solid Catholic principle that man is composed of body and soul. Two different things in him, two distinct things in him. The soul is not the body. But nonetheless, they come together and form one thing, which is the human being. And so, as a result, there is a very intimate interreaction between body and soul. Let me give you an example. When a pilot takes an airplane out, he is extremely reliant upon the good performance of that airplane in order to fly. If he could not take that airplane out, he could not fly. He must make sure that everything is working properly and all of its functions are correct. If it should fail, he will go down with it. So the human soul relies on the brain and the nervous system in general in order to carry on many of its functions. If the brain should be sleeping, if the brain should be dead, if the nervous system is not working properly, the soul is impaired in its functions because it relies on the body for its functions. However, the soul is not the body any more than the pilot is the airplane. The airplane could not fly without the pilot. And the principal action of the airplane is due to the pilot. The airplane would simply sit there and rot if the pilot did not take it out.
What are some of the principal tenets, then, of Catholic psychology? What are some of the principal ideas we have, knowledge of ourselves?
First, that the soul is a spiritual, immaterial, and immortal being. And it's part of us. It is created directly by God. It is not part of the generative process. All the parents do is provide a body for a soul to be infused by God. Those are very important fundamental principles. This soul has not within it any reason why it should stop existing. And furthermore, it is ordered to eternal ideas, eternal goods. It is not happy until it has truth and perfect good. Right? So that is a proof of its immortality. That must be considered in any consideration of psychology. The Catholic Church would absolutely reject any idea of psychology that would make human beings simply a glob of chemicals, and which would see thought and desire and other properly human and spiritual functions simply a highly organized form of chemistry in your brain. That is against Catholic teaching, and it is against even right reason.
It seems that many of the principles of modern psychoanalysis, and not even the principles, but the practical results, are very much militate against Catholic teaching. For instance, an individual may have said to him that, well, you've got to quit repressing these desires. They're creating tension within you. And it may very well be that the Catholic Church says you have to repress these desires. They're evil. What is this relationship? I mean, what then we are told that, oh, but this is as a result of a very faulty understanding of the human mind. That's why they said this. They didn't understand. What's the reaction to this kind of a crisis many people find themselves in when they're told that they have to act in a certain way and ignore what?
Well, there's first of all, it's an implicit denial of free will. The Catholic Church has always been a staunch defender of free will, that a human being is free to choose for himself the goods that are put in front of him, and that no one can do violence to that free will. Even if you are tortured, no one can do violence underneath to your free will. All right? So to imply that the human being is simply a victim of his circumstances, his environment, his upbringing, his emotions of the present moment, is to deny essentially free will. Secondly, it is the idea that you put forth denies original sin. Now here we're in theology. Original sin is revealed by God as being of course, the first sin of Adam, and also the effect that it holds on us even after baptism. Now, in the normal state of things, the lower nature of man, his emotions, should not rebel against the higher nature. It should be the intellect of man and the will of man that are in the driver's seat. And the rest of his body and lower functions should obey. That is the order of God, that the lower obey what is higher. And it is obvious that the highest function that a man can perform is his knowledge of truth, and next to that is his pursuit of the good. And so God has put in man these faculties to know what is true and to love what is good. Everything else in him, all the way down to his little finger, must follow the truth and the good. Okay? So that means that any emotion that you have, or any feeling that goes on in you, must be compared to what is true and what is good, in order to know whether it is something that should be accepted or something that should be repressed. Now, there are many feelings in a human being that happen every day that need to be repressed because they are disordered. Not everything that we feel is in order to the good. If a murderer feels that he doesn't like his next-door neighbor and is filled with hatred, he can't go murder him because he has this feeling. He has to repress that. He has to get down on his knees and ask God for the grace to forgive his enemies and to temper his anger.
One of the major breakthroughs in psychoanalysis was attributed to Sigmund Freud. What is the Catholic's view, or what is the Catholic Church's view of Sigmund Freud and his whole system?
Sigmund Freud is really the founder of modern psychology, and to sum up his doctrine in a nutshell would be to say that every single thought that we have and inclination that comes to us is motivated secretly by the sex drive. I mean, that's Sigmund Freud in one sentence. And this reduces human beings to actually less than animals, because not everything in an animal is for the sex drive. This makes human beings barbarians, and this is utterly opposed to the Catholic Church, as you can imagine from what I've said. That this is something that just reduces human beings to the level of animals. He probably doesn't believe in creation, and I'm sure he doesn't believe in the immortality of the human soul. It again just sees the life and intellectual life as the result of a highly organized matter. And this is impossible. As I said, it's even against all of the principles of nature that simply matter could produce life. Life is motion from an intrinsic principle. When something is alive, it has the power of movement in itself. Okay, that's what life is. It's impossible that matter, by its own power, could produce life. Because matter shows properties that are against life. For example, when you buy a new car, does it feed itself? Does it grow? Does it augment itself? Does it become perfect the way, say, a little plant would, or even a weed in your garden? Does it reproduce itself? You know, of course not. It's just one degradation and deterioration from the showroom to the junkyard. That is the way matter goes. Matter resists organization and always wants to go back to its original state. So if you cannot assign say the music of Mozart to simply a high organization of matter, then any more than you could define his music by simply a coordination of many highly tuned violins. I mean, it's more than that. Yes, life requires a certain organization of matter, but there must be some principle from God that is responsible for the life functions. Okay? And that is, again, the whole response to Freud and to any modern psychologist who would in any way simply assign a material function to the life processes.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned this about Freud. The well-known Catholic psychologist Carl Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud, and I'd like you to react to a statement he made which doesn't seem to, how should I say, jive with Freud's basic hypothesis. He said, more or less, all mental disorders are disorders of religion. Could you react to that?
Yes, that's not true. There are true psychoses based on what I said about the brain. The brain is a very important instrument of the soul. And with the union of body and soul in this state of life, that is before death, it is impossible for the soul to carry on its intellectual functions without the brain. So if something should go wrong in the brain, say like a bad chemical imbalance or brain damage or lack of oxygen to the brain, you're going to see it in the effect of an impaired intellectual activity. So people go senile, for example, or people are schizophrenic due to some problem like that. Paranoia, hallucination, all of these things are possible in the Catholic system because they are all due to some malfunction in the body. There's no problem there because the soul uses the body just like you use a tool. If there's something wrong with the tool, the ultimate effect of what you do will have something wrong with it. Okay, so there's no problem there. The problem arises in seeing the intellectual functions as purely functions of the brain. And when your brain malfunctions, then you as a human being malfunction, and that's, you're no longer a human being. And this is the reason why they would like to put old people to death with euthanasia. That they are no longer considered human beings because they no longer seem to function. They're like machines that have broken down.
How is it that when you mentioned about the soul, that the soul uses the brain actually in its reasoning powers, what happens to the soul then after the body dies? How is it going to reason then?
God must infuse in the soul the knowledge that it wants the soul to have. So much does the soul rely on the body that the soul cannot know anything without the body, apart from the special intervention of God. So, for example, when the particular judgment, in the opinion of theologians, happens immediately after death, as soon as the soul perceives that it is separated from the body, it knows immediately its relationship to God. That is, its immediate knowledge.
Where will the memory rest? I mean, if this is, again, it seems to be a biological function. At the moment of separation, how will the soul recall these things?
Well, the spiritual intellect has its own memory. The brain has its memory. They work hand in hand. But you will not lose your intellectual, spiritual memory. You will remember things from this life. But again, only at the suggestion and the infusion of knowledge from God. Because the soul is incapable of moving without the body.
Has there ever been comment, official church comment from the popes or any of the higher authority with regard to Sigmund Freud, modern psychology in general? Is there an official stance as such?
Not that I know of. It's very possible that Pope Pius XII spoke about it, because he spoke about many things of modern interest. But I know that the points that I have made are from the teaching of the Catholic Church, and any comment that they would make would be simply to apply the teaching of the Catholic Church to modern psychology. That it will not tolerate any kind of treatment of the human being as being devoid of free will, or simply being a victim, an unconscious or unwilling victim of his emotions. This is the trend of modern psychology.
Well, this would seem to throw out quite a bit of modern psychology, though, the whole so-called deterministic school.
Yes, it would. Also, the implicit denial of original sin, it would have to throw out. And modern psychology does implicitly deny original sin. Much of it is based on, if you like it, do it. If that's what you feel like doing, as long as you don't hurt anybody else, go ahead and do it. It's good for you. That is completely contrary to Catholic spirituality. For Catholic spirituality wants to tame the man. Catholic spirituality wants to put the bit in the horse's mouth and make it subject to God, ultimately, and to all of the rules of the spiritual life. And it takes a great mortification. You never heard any saint of the Catholic Church say, well, if you like it, go ahead and do it. I mean, or you never saw any saint simply indulge in the things of this world and his feelings and desires of the moment. I mean, that is completely contrary to the path that the saints have set for us.
One thing I'd like to ask you, Father, as well, it seems really this day and age everyone goes to psychiatrists for almost any reason. They've become the gurus, so to speak, of our society. And granted, as you mentioned, there is legitimate biological mental illness. How much of, you must see this as a priest yourself when people are troubled. What is your feelings on this very easy use of psychiatrist if one feels depressed or one feels guilty, and so on and so forth?
Psychiatrists are like the priests of the modern age. And the reason that they are is because a priest is someone who is a link between this world and the perfect happiness of the next world. But if your perfect happiness is here, if you believe in this world, and you think that you are going to die like an animal dies on the side of the road, never to know or think anything else, right? Then you must achieve your happiness in this world. And you must sacrifice everything to achieve it. And therefore the psychiatrist takes on a great interest for a person who is so convinced about this world, because the psychiatrist will give him the words of wisdom to solve his problems. A priest will give you the words of eternal wisdom and will tell you to mortify your bad inclinations. The psychiatrist will give his blessing to your bad inclinations because you find them inside of yourself. And so psychiatrists will tell people to do the most perverse and impure things in order to find their happiness in this life. As many times the psychiatrists themselves ought to see a psychiatrist. You know, they have their own problems.
What would your recommendations be then for, say, a Catholic who wants to see a psychiatrist, who feels upset or has some kind of a depression or sadness? To what extent is he under obligation to overcome these problems on his own? And to what extent does he have to have professional help? I
would say first he should see a priest, because many of the problems that he has, either depression or problems about impurity or whatever, can be solved by a priest. There is no, in the message of our Lord Jesus Christ, there is no room for depression. It is a message of joy. And he needs to straighten out his spiritual life.
You know, I can remember even reading Catholic's examination of consciences that it is considered a sin to give in to sadness. In closing, could you maybe just explain that briefly? Why is it, what do we mean by this?
It's not a sin to be sad. Our Lord was sad in the agony of the garden. Many other times he wept over Jerusalem. But it's a sin to give in to sadness. That is the beginnings of despair, as if there will never be joy, as if we are condemned to constant sadness. That is depression, and that is something incompatible with the spiritual life.
Father Sanborn, thank you very much for